This week's Parsha is Parshas Tavo, and in this week's Parsha, we are going to look at the different structures of the rebukes, the Toichachos, between what we saw in Bechukosai and what we see in this week's Parsha. And it doesn't feel like there's a lot of similarities, but there was a big debate amongst Spanish Jewish philosophers in the 12th to 14th century about the meaning of the Teichacha, why it's repeated, why is it that there are differences in the structure of the punishments in it. So let's not dwell too much on talking around them, let's talk about them. So first, let's acknowledge the main source for understanding that the two Tochachas have two messages. So that's the Ramban. The Ramban says this in Bamidbar, in Perek Tes Zayin. So this is in the Parsha over there. He's discussing why is it that the curses in Vayikra and Bechukosai are very much geared towards specific things: building altars, bowing down to idols, violating the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. But it talks about being remembered and reestablishing the bris and so on and so forth. In Tavo, it's a little bit different. There's not the same focus on your straying, your worshiping idols. It's also not focusing on sacrifices. It's not focusing on all of those things. It focuses on exile itself, and that there will be foreign kings and unknown languages being spoken towards you. So the Ramban basically says the first curses are referring to the invasion of the Babylonians. So the Galus Bavel, the resulting diaspora created by the incursions of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire, created the situation for the redemption of the first exile resulting from those first set of rebukes. Because we see mentioned numerous times, the Ramban explains, rebukes for doing all types of violations of Torah law. You're serving idols, you're not keeping the Sabbath, you're not keeping the sabbatical year, you are not keeping. And in the second one, he focuses on the fact that specifically there is an invasion and incursion of a foreign government with a language with which they're unfamiliar, which makes sense because they were much more familiar with the spoken language of the Babylonians, which was Aramaic, and they were not familiar with the Greek or Latin that came from the incursions of those invasions, but specifically they were unfamiliar with the Latin of the Romans, and that even shows up regularly, that Latin was super unfamiliar to them. And that's the argument of the Ramban about the pshat in the two separate teichachas. So that's why we have one in Bechukosai, and that's why we have one in this week's Parsha, Tavo. So it sounds like from the Ramban that you have two distinct redemptions from two distinct historical experiences. And on this, the Abarbanel takes issue. The Abarbanel says a few things. Okay, so the Abarbanel is writing this in his Perush on this week's Parsha. So he goes into the logic of saying there's two distinct exiles, as if one doesn't touch the other, as if, there is a Galus Bavel, and then there's a Galus post Bayeshena, Galus Edom, or Galus Roimi. So the Ramban does make it sound like that. He makes it sound that they are distinct. But it does seem like certain elements do carry over, even from Bayis Rishon, the destruction of Bayis Rishon, that carry over into Bayesheni, into the Second Temple period. So that's his first issue. His second issue is, why is there a distinct end of resulting in the the compensation for the missed sabbatical cycles, but that's not in the second one. Why does the second one lack that finite description of time? The Ramban says that's why the first one talks about fulfilling the sabbatical years, not the second one. So, are we bound to assume that the second temple period represents a full redemption from the Galus of Bavel? And if that was the case, why did only a small number of people return? You can look them up in Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a list, and that's not that many people. A few thousand people come back. And again, they were still subject to other nations. So they were subject to the Madai, the Parsi, the Avanim, the Romim, or Edom. Second temple period didn't have all of those things that they had in the first temple period. There wasn't the Aron Kodesh. They didn't have that. Okay, so the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaBris, wasn't there. They didn't get back to Urim V'Tumim. They got a whole bunch of stuff, but they didn't get that back. Okay, and also there was always in the first temple period a pillar of smoke, which was absent in the second temple. So these miraculous things didn't come back. So those things clearly extend from one into the other. So he avers that the Ramban is correct. Yes, the first Teichacha, the first rebuke, really is the first temple period. But the stuff in the second temple, it's not there. Okay, so it doesn't it doesn't show up. So it seems like one really kind of moved on into the other. So the assumption can be instead that the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the first temple's falling is really a continuation of the exile itself. It's one big long thing. So it's this big differentiation. So he says, for example, certain things that are not repeated in the first temple period. So there are several things, and so he points out that the things like being plundered and seeing your sons and daughters carried away, which are all mentioned in this one, doesn't happen in the first temple period. Okay, these are specific to Agrippas, and not like it happened at Tzidkiyahu in Bavel. And also the idea that the strange people will rise above you, that was a second temple period issue, not in the first one. And the idea that they were being sold in slavery in ships, also second temple period. So he agrees with that case. So he's trying to draw a parallel to that the bris of the first was never fully ended, but was really enforced. God held us in contempt, as it were, for violating it for the first one. So the first bris in Bechukosai, that says there's a finite amount of punishment for the first contemptuous actions, right? Hold you in contempt for the first violation. The second bris that's made here in this week's Parsha, this is saying that there are so many things that need to be fixed, we're not giving you an end. So things like idolatry and so on is because those things were not really a problem through the extended period of time through the second temple period. Really, the idea is that many of the things that had begun in the first temple, while rectified, but some of the deeper problems had not really been resolved. So he notes that there is a future Geula, and the reason why it's repeated is to teach us that our extension of history continues on into a greater experience. And that greater experience is sort of a vector of history. And that vector of history is seeing how, as we improve, the improvement becomes how we interact and treat and behave with each other. And these are all things that are meant to be addressed through the experience of the Second Temple period. So his interpretation of the Second Temple period really reflects on the bad and negative experiences in the Roman period, such as the Pompey's conquest and Herod's campaign, and also in the revolt. These are all reflected into it. So these are all things that are mentioned in there, and the punishments are also very reflective of it. but the main problem is trying to fix those experiences, those negative experiences that are not there, that are not corrected. And until those things are rectified, in a sense, we really aren't redeemed, and the covenant continues to be upheld and go on. And at that point, when we recognize the issues, we recognize that only then will there be a full redemption. So in many ways, our own current historical epoch, where we are experiencing a renewal of an independent Jewish state in Israel today, is really an experience that had been planned throughout history. There'll be rises and falls until we finally learn how to rectify the issues that need to be rectified. And so the Rabbi Abarbanel, in many ways, is challenging the idea of the Ramban to say that no, we only have two possible diasporas. But really, the truth is that the diaspora has been continuous because we lack many of the things that were there in Bayis Rishon. And in many ways, that's what we have to strive forwards. And we will continue this idea into Parshas Nitzavim. The Abarbanel actually points it out. He says that the blessings that are accrued at the end of Parshas Kisavo are a preamble to what we're going to discuss in Parshas Nitzavim. And so we'll save that discussion for next week. Good Shabbos.